Question number 12, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Tertiary Education, Skills and Employment. Does he stand by all his statements to the House last week in respect of tertiary education organisations?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, yes.
Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
To the Minister, does he stand by his statement regarding funding requirements on tertiary organisations, that oversight agencies are, and I quote, entitled to expect that the governors and operators meet those requirements and make representations to the Tertiary Education Commission that are correct?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, yes I do.
Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
To the Minister, is he aware that a sitting National MP was a member of that board and oversaw this systemic rorting? And if so, has he asked Barbara Kuraga MP why rorting at Taratahi went on for so long under her watch and what she did about it?
Honourable Stephen Joyce, either of those two supplementary
Mr.
questions.
Speaker, I think the member is being deliberately nasty, and fair enough for him.
Just answer the question.
In relation to Taratahi, Mr Speaker, there is some issues, as the member knows. I would point out that there is an investigation both from the TEC and from other agencies, and I think we should let those other agencies complete their investigations.
Point of order, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, respectfully, I do not believe that the Minister has addressed the specific question.
The question was quite long. There were two parts of the question. Was he aware that this particular national member was on the board? The second part was, has he spoken to them?
Had he asked her, yes.
And the Honourable Stephen Joyce, if he could address either of those two supplementary questions.
Mr Speaker, no.
Thank you.
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable David Cunliffe, supplementary question.
Mr Speaker, to the Minister, why was no action taken by the Tai Potini Polytech Council in relation to a Protected Disclosures Act investigation requested by a Quality Assurance Manager in 2013 because of a, quote, failure to maintain an auditable standard of enrolment and credit, and because of health and safety concerns?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr Speaker, if the member would like to provide that information, which he claims to be the case, then I'd be more than happy to have a look at it for him. I have looked at the information he's provided through the media last week in relation to some suggested matters with Tai Potini, and so far have not been able to discern anything that hasn't already been previously addressed. But if he has an issue he'd like to raise, more than happy for him to supply that information and I'll address it.
Supplementary
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to table a document showing that allegations of systemic rorting were raised with the Tai Potini Polytech Council on 20 December 2013, it being a letter from a then Quality Assurance Manager dated 20 December 2013 to a then Council member.
Leave us thought to table that particular document. Is there any objection? There is none that can be tabled.
Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David.
No, point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable
Mr
David.
Speaker, I seek leave to table a letter to myself from that Quality Assurance Manager.
Order! This is a point of order. If the member would
carry
carry
relevant to the fact that the letter is not publicly available, which asks why the TEC would investigate and say the figures for the courses were accurate when evidence was provided that they were not.
The letter's now been described. It doesn't need to be further described. Leave us sought to table that particular letter to the Honourable Member. Is there any objection? There is objection. Order.
Point of order.
Point of order.
Just clarifying, was there objection?
Order. I ruled there was objection. I heard objection.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, how can the public have confidence in the national government's oversight of tertiary institutions when more examples of tertiary rorting are coming to light every week and now a member of their own caucus is implicated in this scandal?
Order. Order. The last part of that question is out of order. I'll allow the very first part. The last part is completely out of order. Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr Speaker, Detective Sherlock over there has so far released some information into the public domain.
Order. 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 Point of order has been called.
Mr Speaker, you've been much more rigid in your application of the standing orders and Speaker's rulings this week. And one of the most basic standing orders is that members have to be referred to by their appropriate names or titles.
Order. I actually didn't hear the interjection, but I do acknowledge it was... there was an interjection. I didn't hear it. If the Minister could start his answer again, he simply asked about whether he has confidence. How can New Zealanders have confidence in tertiary education? No, I don't need any assistance from the member. The member's asked the question. It has not yet been answered.
Well, Mr Speaker, the member has raised some information in the public domain in the last few days, all of which information has been raised previously with the TEC and NZQA and thoroughly investigated at the time. From what I can see, the member has got completely the wrong end of the stick. But if he has new information, I repeat my invitation to him. Rather than grandstanding about it, happy to read it and see if it needs acting on.
That concludes questions for oral answer. Would some... point of order, Ron Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to draw to your attention, sir. The Honourable Maggie Barry is currently wearing a lapel badge of one of the flag designs options in the silence.
Order. Can we have the point of order, please?
The point of order is I'd like to refer you to Speaker's ruling 18.1 regarding advertising and ask for you look and ask... Second point of order, am I entitled to have this heard in silence?
Well, if the member would come with a point of order, get to it quickly, I'll listen to it. Otherwise, we're wasting the House's time. Can I have the point of order?
Point of order is regarding advertising in the House and regarding being in breach of the Flag Referendum Act passed through this House and the appropriateness of a person wearing an advertising lapel pin which is one of the flag designs and should not be worn.
Order. I'll hear from the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, the choice of lapel badge by any Member of Parliament is in fact their own choice. It can well be considered to be a piece of jewellery. Just as I noticed, someone on the member's side is wearing a silver fern, which could equally... No, the member's not. He's got his SAS badge on, but the other members have a... the other members have a silver fern on there. That could equally be considered advertising. As, of course, could the various boxes sitting out there be considered advertising for New Zealand First? Mr Speaker, I think we've got to be very, very careful. We don't get too precious about this.
Order. Order. No, I don't need any further assistance. Order. I don't consider for one moment that the wearing of a lapel badge or a fern like I often wear is in any way advertising and breaching the rules of this House. Would some honourable member care to move that the House take note of miscellaneous business? The Honourable Bill English.